First of all, we want to start by acknowledging that the conversation that we are having today and facilitating today is taking place in a territory that has experienced the tensions of colonization. This workshop is being supported by the resources of San Diego State University and is hosted by the Spanglish MFT certificate. And therefore, we want to acknowledge that the university stands in Kumeyaay territory. And I'm going to read the Kumeyaay land acknowledgement statement written by Mike Connolly Miswish. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been a part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony, and we find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. So we are acknowledging the history of linguistic appropriation and the current predominance of the English language in our practices, in our everyday lives. And facilitating conversations in non-English languages is a way to acknowledge a history of colonization as well. And so I'm going to pass it now to Leilani Gujen, who is our member of the Spanglish MFT certificate. And Leilani very graciously has joined us to introduce Tri. So muchas gracias, Leilani.
Gracias, Marcela. Chào các bạn và quý đồng nghiệp. Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Leilani Nguyen, and we have the honor of having Tri here with us today. Tri Nguyễn is a 1.5 generation bicultural bilingual Vietnamese American. He grew up in San Diego, California, and is a first generation college graduate. He has over 10 years of experience working in community mental health, particularly with Asian Pacific Islanders and monolingual immigrant communities. Currently, he is a practicing licensed family therapist at Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, Washington. He also has a small online private practice offering therapeutic services to California and Washington state residents. He recently completed a PhD in psychology from the Taos Institute and Free University of Brussels, or VUB. And his dissertation examines the interrelationships between interculturality, decoloniality, and multicultural competence counseling practices. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Tri. And with that being said, we'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Leilani, and thank you, Marcela, for introductions. And can you all hear me okay? I'm using my laptop, so I'm going to try to speak louder than I used to. But yes, I am very grateful for this opportunity to share my research and my journey as a clinician, and I guess what is a little bit about some idea I have about Vietnamese Centered Therapies, and I'm going to try to reduce most of what I've been studying in the past 7 years into like a 20-minute description. So I am very excited and a little bit nervous because I haven't really shared much of these ideas outside of my defense and some of the participants that I have been interviewing about a cultural competency and how to, I guess, integrate some of those ideas and into decolonial practices, as well as, I should say, interculturality as well, and some of the new terminology that I have come across since I began to do my research on cultural competency counseling practices. So I'm going to start with sharing my screen, but also I want to acknowledge, because I'm not in San Diego right now, I'm from San Diego, but currently I'm in Whidbey Island, Washington. So it is about an hour and a half north of Seattle. And the land I'm in is part of the is originally from the Squamous, Suquamish and Snohomish tribe of Native American. It is, I'm on this island. It's got mostly military communities. There's a naval air stations here. So I've been up here for about a year and a half, a little bit over a year actually. And it is raining a lot, but I really enjoy the outdoor. Definitely different than the dry San Diego I've been familiar with. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started here. So to start out, as you know, I identify as a bilingual and bicultural person. So I was born in Vietnam and grew up in San Diego. I was there since my family immigrated over to San Diego when I was 10 years old, and we are part of the third wave of immigrant. After the fall of Saigon, many Vietnamese left the country by boat before or right immediately after. That's the first wave. The second waves are the Vietnamese who escaped Vietnam after the communists took over, and I think for the next 10 years, from 1975 to 85, I think that's roughly estimated about 500,000 people died at sea because they left by boat. So my family got the privilege to left the country by plane because I have an Amerasian sister. She was adopted by my parents. So we end up leaving Vietnam because we were so poor, and that's like the best way how my parent can try to give us a better life. So yeah, my Vietnamese is at a 10-year level when I left Vietnam. So I took some courses. So it's have improved a little bit, and working with the Vietnamese community in San Diego and involving in the Vietnamese student associations of Southern California and so forth. So my Vietnamese somewhat improved. And then the last 5 years I worked with the Navy, which mostly non-Vietnamese speaking population. So it's got a little bit of rocky, turbulent time trying to regain my Vietnamese skill again. So I'll be happy to share more about that, I guess, on this, if you have any questions. But I recently started private practice online, and I have some Vietnamese speaking clients. And that really helped me get accustomed to doing therapy in Vietnamese again. So Elizabeth, that is a little bit about my background. So I am a licensed family therapist. I'm also alumni from San Diego State. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share and contribute. So I do see some familiar faces on here, so that's awesome. And then, I'm gonna start sharing about, so I already talked about my experiences, but I wanted to share a little bit about some terminologies and the background of my research, mainly on cultural competency, decoloniality, and intercultural practices. So I just want to see to get an idea of how many folks are familiar with I guess cultural competency. If we could, I guess if you could raise a hand or something. Okay, great. Okay, what about decoloniality? Okay, so good number. How about interculturality or intercultural? Okay, so sound like most of you are familiar with these concepts, so that's great. Basically, I wanted to share that. So I started out, I got interested in cultural competence, I guess in grad school, and I wanted to learn about how to, I guess, what are the different ways to improve, I guess, access to services in the Vietnamese community. because coming from a family, I have family members, especially my dad, who have depressions and substance abuse problem. And that really triggered my motivation to be an advocate for the Vietnamese community, as well as the minority community or the people of colors struggle to get appropriate mental health services. So that's how I got interested in multicultural counseling. And then as I studied further into, of course, my master program and my PhD, I wanted to explore other way to improve services. So my research is a critique of cultural competence practices, because is in many ways very essentializing and causing a lot of confusion about what is culture. And because culture is so broad that when we talk about cultural competence, people end up talking about very surface, like there's a call, I forgot which author, but talk about how cultural competence is like talking about holidays and food and aspect of culture, right? Which is a very nationalized and essentialized way of looking at people. So I have began to do more research and look into decoloniality and interculturality, which I will share in the next few slides about how they look different and how they challenge cultural competence framework, as I will explain a little bit more. And maybe you guys can even talk about it in your discussions in the breakout group. So basically, I realized that cultural competence is, or many authors have critiqued cultural competence as a very, I guess, Americanized version of trying to be responsive to different culture and ethnicity and value and practices, right? And there have been a shift regarding decoloniality and also transitioning away from the whole word culture in general, and to focus more on language and epistemology. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, right? So how do we know what we know, and where do we get our knowledge from? And the critique of cultural competence is that it's based on European and Euro-American practices, as well as, I guess, what we learn in graduate school about counseling practices. The majority of them are, or I guess, I don't know what the number is, but most of them are from the Euro-American way of looking at mental health and mental healing. So, so the idea, and I think Marcella might probably have more to say about this regarding how language could be a really crucial role in counseling and therapy, and I can have her share about that a little bit later, because she probably can verbalize better than I do regarding that aspect. But the idea is that we want to shift away from using the word culture and looking at language and how that shapes therapy and people view of themselves, as well as looking at the different kind of knowledges. So there's not just one knowledge with a big K, right? Or there's not only one ideas or theory that work for all people, which is the cultural competence framework tend to push for that. Is that if you modify some cultural practices, or I mean some counseling practices to fit a certain cultural population, then it'll be okay and it'll work just fine. But if you are bilingual clinicians and you work with bilingual community or bicultural community, you probably realize that things don't always translate from one language to another. The way that cultural competence tend to idealize, or the way that many theory that originate in America and in Europe have the assumption that is universal and that could be applied to all culture and all people. So that's a little bit about how the limitation of cultural competency ideas and practices that have been challenged by decoloniality and other way to look at culture and counseling practices. So decoloniality, as most of you probably aware, is looking at how colonialism impact the people. So it look at before colonialism, during colonial, and after. Right? So it looked the whole history. So to address how colonialism impacted the native people. During and after, of course, but it's also the movement is to look at how people live and the kind of knowledges that they use, they practice before the colonial time, right? So, so I don't want to go too much more into that, but people have questions, we can definitely talk about it. And then interculturality is the framework that I recommended from my research is as a possible alternative to cultural competence, because it's look at intergroup dialogues and looking at the meeting places that when two cultures come together and how can they create understanding and collaborations without favoring a certain culture. In many cases, mostly the dominant culture don't take over the conversation or putting their idea as better than another, right? And interculturality has been popularized in education and in international education and international communication in the 50s. But it hasn't really been explored or applied in culture, in counseling and therapy. So far as I know, not yet, right? So I know that's a lot. So I have some graph to show you all what I just talked about. Hopefully it will explore or help explain more about what I'm talking about all these terminologies. So as you are probably familiarized with cultural competence and cultural humility. So in the graph, it shows that, of course, cultural competence based on, of course, started in the 1970s by Sue and Peterson and their colleagues trying to explore different ways to improve cultural, improve counseling and to address the cultural differences of people of color. And they presented the tripartite model, which is awareness, knowledge, and skills. And that has been really a big push for multicultural competence in the 80s and the 90s. Not until 1995, when Tervalon and Murray Garcia presented the concept of cultural humility, where it's challenged the cultural competence model of that was based on expertise driven, right? So if you look at the model of cultural competence up until the 90s, it was all about how to work with how to work with Asian, how to work with Black, and a lot of how to, right? Because it's focusing on these three frameworks, awareness, knowledge, and skills. But they don't really talk about how to work with Caucasian or white population, because the assumption is that only people of color or minority need to be looked at or examined their cultural makeup. So, and then not until, so 1995, when cultural humility come out, it challenged that concept, is putting the therapist from a not knowing stance, right? You want to be curious and not assume that you know people's culture. So cultural humility pretty much challenged cultural competence idea of expertise and knowledge-driven agenda. And then, of course, in 2016, cultural competence model finally got revised to add the intersectionality and social justice dimension. As you all know, social justice has been a big thing in the past 2 decades or so. And it's been integrated into the cultural competence framework. And then, of course, at the same time, cultural humility got incorporated as well, and it's go under cultural competence. So the latest revision, assuming that cultural humility is part of cultural competence. So now cultural humility is within the framework under cultural competence. Okay. So what did I learn from my research? I interviewed 16 clinicians of colors who have experiences in cultural competence, and I asked them about how do they define culture, what are the differences between cultural humility and cultural competency, and what do they prefer, right? Like what does cultural competence look like when they work with different clients? And I learned, this is really only a brief summary of what I learned and I wanted to share today, given the limited time. But what I learned was that there is tremendous confusion between cultural humility and cultural competency. A lot of folks who I asked, these are clinicians of colors, they're licensed and they have been in training with cultural competence. Not all of them have been training cultural humility, but when I presented the two frameworks, most of the time they say they prefer cultural humility. They prefer the not knowing stance and the idea behind cultural humility, because it doesn't assume expertise and so forth, right? But what I learned is that although most people say they support cultural humility, their descriptions of what they do in practice really represent cultural competency, represent expertise. So looking at culture and knowledge and skills and awareness and so forth. So that's was one of the defining factor that I learned from my research. The other really difficulty to acknowledge for myself as well, the participant, is that I learned that that I, as a researcher, as well as some participant, and not all participants in my study, is that we reinforce a lot of the essentialized and stereotype practices. So when I look at the way I ask questions and the way I interview, I learned that I pretty much bite into the monocultural lens, that the word I use, the languages I use, that sometimes pretty much reinforce a lot of these stereotype practices about different culture and values. Okay, and then the last point that I want to share is that I learned from the research was that therapists of color, even though some of us think that we are more cultural competence, and the research in cultural competency have shown that we tend to be more culturally competent than, I guess, white or Caucasian population. We also reinforce and endorse a lot of the Eurocentric approaches to healing. And we're not aware of most of the indigenous way or indigenous practices that are that could be, helpful for the client population that we work with. So, so here are some more pictures to better describe what I just shared, right? So prior to the 1970, or I guess 1970, yeah, that's when cultural competence started. the counseling and therapy field tend to look at everything from a monocultural lens, right? There's not much attention to minority populations and their and why they don't show up to counseling and why don't they seek help, right? So it's assumed that the universe is have a very universalist assumptions about counseling and therapy, and then there's that it doesn't matter what cultural makeup you are, is you can still benefit from counseling. So it's very universalistic. As you can see, the figure that I share, of course, this is very general and very the big picture of what I'm talking about. It doesn't address doesn't address genders and other category of culture, right? Like economics and so forth. So this is a very general idea that I want to show. So that's the monocultural lens, right? And then you got the multicultural lens, which is assuming that the host culture, I guess just like in the US, where we assume that Euro-American way of doing therapy can be applied to other culture. So the multicultural orientation framework assumes that you can translate, that you can modify some of the practices to make it work, right? So it's still assuming a universal lens, despite acknowledging the different cultural makeup from the host culture. And then, and this is the intercultural lens, where you focus more on the in-between, right? The meeting place, but without emphasizing on the host culture, knowledges and value. But you also pay attention to the knowledges and value that come from the immigrants and the indigenous cultural groups. As you can see, that's a little bit different than multicultural framework. And in my research, I also came across or got pointed out that what is missing in what I was examining was a transcultural lens. This is very popular in European because transculturalism or transculturality look at the intermixing of culture. And this was coined by the Cuban author in the 1940s about he was studying African immigrant who come to Cuba to work in the tobacco plantation, and he was looking at how cultures intermix and was portrayed. How, I guess, the idea that two cultures come together and they live together for a while, they form a new culture, kind of like many assimilation or acculturation theory. You know how in America we have so many bicultural people. I guess Vietnamese American, I identify as that. So we have value both Vietnamese and American and so forth, right? So it is a very, but the idea is very universal, and it's been critiqued as a very idealism way to look at, to examine cultural makeup. But it's also seemed to be very supported by many European scholars, because how Europe is also very intermixing as we currently speak. So what to do about, so how do we incorporate decolonialism and the intercultural lens into therapy and counseling? So I have come across a few ideas or a few examples. And so there have been many, in many other countries, I think in Latin America, and in New Zealand, for example, and even in the US, way to incorporate indigenous practices and bridging mental health and indigenous practices and spiritual healer in one place without putting a priority in what is better, right? So these are two books that is being published. The first one is by Mario Incayawa. He was a psychiatrist who learned psychiatry in the US and come back to Cuba and open a clinic where he invites spiritual healers to work with him so that they can provide services to the local community. And they can cross-refer each other for services without, so that's how they increase the local community trust, building trust, as well as providing services that not just medications and talk therapy, right? But also being very inclusive of the traditional and culture of that country. And the other example was in New Zealand, where I think a spiritual healer worked alongside with a psychiatrist as well to help the local populations to provide services that are really culturally responsive. And to focus on decoloniality and interculturality, there need to be the intervention and research need to be developed and within the local knowledges and practices, right? That is another key issues that haven't been much explored in cultural competency literature or cultural humility that we are familiar with in the US. An example that I identified in my research was that, how some VA hospital here in Washington state, actually, that had a sweat lodge built in to help treat PTSD, to help Indian American who will suffer from PTSD from the Vietnam War, as well as other war. So that's another example of incorporating the tradition, indigenous way of healings alongside with the Euro-American practices. So and I'm running out of time. My last slide talking about, so what could be a Vietnamese Centered Therapies? So of course, this is something I just came up with and that I think would be most appropriate. But of course, this is not the all and end all. This is only based on my ideas and what I think would be appropriate. And I don't know if there are really a Vietnamese Centered Therapy model out there, which I think it need to be explored, right? So some of the idea that I wanted to share is that to have Vietnamese Centered Therapy, of course, we need to focus on the Vietnamese languages and knowledges. So there are not really much research or history of mental health treatment in Vietnam that are exclusively Vietnamese, right? We don't know. We do know some basic idea about traditional healing practices, which is by coining, using Thuốc Bắc, Thuốc Nam, which is Chinese and Vietnamese medicine, combination of that. There is, of course, fortune telling and cosmological readings. As we all know, if we have aunt and uncle who tend to do that. I know my sister really into that. So that could be another way to explore traditional practices that could be very important, outside of the talk therapy that we are trained in. And ancestor worship, as you know, very important in the Vietnamese community. And how do we incorporate that into counseling, as well as family traditions and different spiritual practices. I know back in Vietnam, we go to temple, many times a year to just pray and talk to the monk and priest. And that is a very important thing that we have back in Vietnam, but not many of us have here in the US, because we do have temple, but sometimes it's very far and not very conducive to what we are familiar with, right? And then another important factor to consider is, of course, when we work with Vietnamese population, is to of course speak the language that our clients are familiar with. So either Vietnamese and English, or English, right? And services, if we can do home-based, if possible, I think that can be really important to build therapeutic alliance. And of course, services should be accessible and affordable to the person seeking help. The point that is important to pay attention to is this. I don't know if there's much practice-based evidence about best way to work with Vietnamese population, and that's a very general description. But we also need to distinguish how mainland Vietnamese and the Vietnamese in the U.S. and abroad, as well as, I guess, within Vietnam, you got the North, Central and South, and we got different dialects and different way to practice, right? Ways of life and healing practices that I don't know if there is a way to examine all of that. So there definitely need to be more research and to look into the best practices for Vietnamese in Vietnam, as well as Vietnamese abroad. And like I mentioned in the other example, there need to be mutual collaboration between Western mental health practices, as well as indigenous healing practices that I don't believe have been explored much in my experience in graduate school and in multicultural counseling courses. I don't see much of that, and I think there's definitely a need for that. One example would be, why are we not inviting spiritual healers and cosmological readers into our multicultural counseling courses? And maybe they can share with us how do they work, and how can we collaborate with them to work with clients who might have that interest, right? So I think there's so much to be learned about indigenous healing practices that is not yet examined in our multicultural counseling curriculum that we are familiar with. So that's all. I know I ran a little bit over time here. I hope you guys some of these ideas are relevant to what you are here for today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have before we do the breakout.